I promised myself I wouldn't make any more long-form videos about American film history because the story's been done to death. With my position in the world, I owe it to the conversation to shed some light on other, less spoken about perspectives, narratives, and canons, even if it doesn't get as many views. Then, earlier this year, David Lynch died. I was reminded that he may very well have been my favorite artist, at least for some time, and I also realized that he was probably the greatest, or rather the only great, living American filmmaker. I made a post in my community tab, yapping off dome, about this thought, also because this one clip I posted with Orson Welles cooking about America's legacy of imperialism was blowing up, and it gave me a thought.
It's an awful big country, an awful lot of different kinds of people in it, and violence always has been part of our story. That's the way we won the country and stole it away from the Indians and all the rest of it.
The thought was that there have only been maybe 3 great American filmmakers: Lynch, Welles, and D.W. Griffith. Yes, the inventor of racism, but not quite for the reason you might think. When I say great, that doesn't necessarily speak to the quality of what they made per se, it's more speaking to the legacy, and the role they have in the grand narrative of what we call the American cinematic canon, how much their work shaped the face of what we call American cinema on an industrial level, on a formal level, and on a philosophical level. How different would what we call American cinema be had they not existed and done what they did when they did? But I also made a point to specify that in the narrative of what I call American cinema, I don't want to throw black films under the bus. I think the African American cinematic canon exists in spite of people like Griffith, Welles, and Lynch. Because if we're talking about the greats, I also want to say Spike Lee. For all the narrative and industrial impact that Griffith, Welles, and Lynch had, I would easily say Spike Lee fits the bill. In fact, he made what I might call, funny enough, Ryan Coogler said the same thing, the greatest American film. And it truly is an American film. Why is Malcolm X, which is on paper the most African American film, just an American film for me? And why is that kind of a bad thing? Does my opinion of this matter at all? Do any of these questions make any sense? Let's talk about American cinema. The story of American cinema to me has always been a story about America, and what America is or ought to be, usually told from the perspective of someone who has some criticisms about what America is, who themselves has an interesting position within the American socioeconomic context. D.W. Griffith hijacked techniques innovated and used by several different nations and disciplines who had been experimenting with the medium up to that point, using his disproportionate amount of resources and capital, using the newly established Hollywood studio system to make a great epic about the Civil War and why the Klan was needed to I am not finishing that sentence. You could call it the first superhero film, one of the few genres that America actually invented. I like to believe that Mr. Devil Worshipper Griffith genuinely believed the rubbish in Birth of a Nation and sought to shed light on what he saw as a social ill in his society. It was based on a novel, but using his resources, he was able to bring about that story, that narrative to the screen, and have an impact that can only ever be achieved by such effectively done conservative propaganda. He played on the majority public's paranoias and fears of a rising threat to their society, centering the experiences of that majority, a particular demographic of that majority mind you, and effectively ostracized the experience of the other, relegating them to a vague threat and element in the majority's story. I think Birth of a Nation and Griffith's other films defined the tradition of theft and centering the experiences of the majority. American cinema, really the American narrative, has always been a story of theft of others' techniques, of their land, their talent, and claiming it for yourself.
If they had had Indians in England before they were Englishmen there,
well,
that they
had some Indians in India.
America first should mean natives first. But their land was stolen, and those who did the theft have made it difficult for everyone else to exist within or even compete with it. The Hollywood system gathered all the resources and used them to continue to take and take from others, prioritizing their narratives, structure, and tropes. The American cinematic narrative to me has always been connected to the existence of Hollywood, though they don't always actually have to work within Hollywood.
The time you were giving this role, were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. You know, we did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie.
The reason Orson Welles stands out as another great American filmmaker is precisely because of his doomed relationship with Hollywood, and the fact that he then became the first mainstream indie filmmaker. Black filmmakers and women filmmakers had been working at the time, particularly in the silent era, but come the era of the Hollywood system, they were shunned. In the American narrative, they were the first real indie filmmakers because due to how Hollywood operated then as an industrial machine, they just weren't allowed roles of authority. The function of Hollywood as a machine that explicitly worked to turn out products was precisely why when Orson Welles entered, he was such an anomaly. Welles came from wealth, having traveled the world with his inventor father as a child and started his career in his teens. Already a famous playwright, actor, and radio personality before 25, he was given an unprecedented offer to make whatever film he wanted. So he hired the finest people he could in the industry, took his established Mercury Theatre group, and made the first of what could be called an auteur-driven story under that system. So Welles, knowing basically nothing about the craft of cinema, just took what skills he had, using the people around him, and crafted what is still often called the greatest American film of all time. Citizen Kane, which I've spoken about like 6 times on my channel before, so let me digress. Kane and Welles' other work responds to the narrative started by Griffith because it challenges oppressive systems, hero narratives, and the idea of the great man. Citizen Kane could be seen as a story about the failings of capitalism.
You talk about the people as though you own them. You've talked about giving the people their rights, as if you could make them a present of liberty.
Welles' theatre work often took Shakespeare and applied it to contemporary or historical settings to tell political allegory. His first Broadway hit in the 1930s took Macbeth and set it in Haiti during the time of the Haitian Revolution, using an entirely black cast. He took Julius Caesar and set it in then contemporary fascist Italy. My goat. Needless to say, he was branded a communist and thrown out of Hollywood before the end of the decade, and went on to finance the rest of his films mostly out of pocket while in Europe. Like Griffith, I think you can see the face of what film was in America and how it was changed after his work within the system. And even after he left, his greatness comes from both how technically innovative his work was and how he challenged the norms and politics of the industry at that time with the scale that he had. The era of independent cinema would come with the 1960s, but by the 70s the industry would regain some level of control, but this time giving a bit more freedom to their directors. It was clear that the people had a taste for that roughness and authenticity. This era would see the rise of other subgenres and independent film movements that were from more niche and or fringe voices. It was also at this time that a strange little avant-garde painter and craftsman artist started experimenting with cameras, making short films and such. But it would be in the early 70s that he was given free financing by the American Film Institute, some friends and family, to bring his little freak visions to life.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
Elaborate on that.
No.
To me, the narrative of American cinema has been the question of what America even is. It is the narrative of a country at war with itself. What Griffith did was challenge a country changing in a direction he didn't like, using the aesthetics of nostalgia to speak to the heart of the country's majority. What Welles did was challenge a country troubled by various social inequities, using the traditions of European theatre and storytelling to tell political cautionary tales. I'm not sure that David Lynch deliberately had an agenda as overtly political as either of them, but he took his own feelings and experiences of Americanness to talk about the evils of the everyday. He unironically grew up in the picket fence 1950s white American nuclear suburbia, and the trauma he experienced when he left that setting haunted him. In David Lynch's work, you can see criticisms of the nuclear family, ableism, my undiagnosed autistic king, the institution of marriage, heteronormativity, and of course the Hollywood system itself. The greatest anomaly, though, was the fact that they let him work in Hollywood for most of his career, his weirdness becoming the brand itself. The most direct impact you can probably see is on television. Twin Peaks may very well have been the most important American TV show of all time, and again, the fact that it aired when it did, the way it is such an anomaly. And the impact there can be seen much more directly. It was after Twin Peaks that American television became more cinematic. More shows took on that serialized approach. They became more experimental. When I went back through all of David Lynch's major films besides Dune, the week he died, I noticed this theme more prominently than ever before, and I kind of relate to it actually. When I look at David Lynch's work, given his childhood, given what he said about his own experiences, the question it all seems to ask is, what if the world that's been protecting you has been hurting others? What if just beyond the reach of your streetlight, unimaginable darkness lies? You know, that's why David Lynch's fan base is comprised mostly of women, neurodivergents, and queer people. It's so interesting because, like I intimated before, his primary industry was film, and you can see his impact there, sure, but the biggest waves were made on television, in gaming, comics, music even. Perhaps because the film world, Hollywood, the market, does remain a bit evil. Welles was kicked out of Hollywood repeatedly, turned out financial flops, and exiled himself to Europe. Even Griffith, pioneer of evil himself, faced ostracization and financial failures towards the end of his career too. David Lynch's final two feature films, one of which is cited as the greatest film of the 21st century, both quite directly criticize Hollywood, and he'd retire from feature filmmaking in 2006, focusing on his smaller projects and music, only returning to television with Twin Peaks: The Return, which itself can be read as a criticism of the industry. The war with the industry is a constant you will find with these filmmakers who are considered visionary, because the industry, the American film industry, is not designed for that kind of thing. It exists largely to ostracize and stifle that kind of singularity and otherness. The other movements that have happened within the American canon have largely had to compete and create their own lineages in spite of this industry, which is the real reason why I don't want to throw African American cinema under the bus like that. African American cinema exists in spite of Hollywood, I think. But yet, Hollywood would not exist had it not been for them. The American narrative would not have its power at all had it not been for that dynamic, that tension. Who were they fighting over in Birth of a Nation anyway? This brings us to the other figure that presents a fork in the road of my little narrative here. Spike Lee checks almost every box that I have set up in my arbitrary narrative about American cinema. His relationship with Hollywood is interesting. His work constantly deals with the question of what America is or ought to be. His position within the American socio-political context gives him an interesting perspective, and he's undoubtedly influenced the direction of American cinema since he started. The difference, though, is that the three figures who I've called great, Griffith, Welles, and Lynch, come from positions of relative power, the majority, and speak to those within the majority. Their work can be seen as reflective of how that majority views themselves. However, Spike speaks from a minority. He speaks in response to the narrative set up by the majority. While Lynch's work asks what the world that's protected him has been doing to others, Spike Lee's work speaks to what the world that's been protecting David Lynch has been doing to him. There have been many great independent black filmmakers throughout the years of American cinema, particularly in the 70s, of course. There were several who emerged making their own films, though they were usually independent films, or they were considered lowbrow exploitation films and viewed mostly by black audiences and Quentin Tarantino. But Lee was one of the first to really break into the mainstream. And by mainstream, I mean white people. White people actually saw his films and generally accepted him, though of course his work was always very controversial.
Let me tell you the story of right hand, left hand.
The story of good and evil. H-A-T-E. It was with this left hand that old brother Cain
Iced his brother. Love. These 5 fingers.
These fingers has veins that run straight to the soul of man.
Lee drew and took inspiration from Hollywood, studied the masters. He was even a student of Scorsese's for some time in NYU, but always with an acute awareness of the inherent corruption of that world and how these images have been used to harm people like him. He makes his students in NYU, where he now teaches, watch Birth of a Nation, for the same reason why I've seen Birth of a Nation multiple times now. You need to know what this art form is capable of. All the greatness and all the evil. You need to know who set the rules of the game and how those tools have been used. Truly, especially now. I don't think there's ever been a more important time to learn how to read propaganda and how ubiquitous these ideas are in the language of the mediums you work in. Let's talk about Malcolm X. Citizen Kane has been called the greatest American film of all time. Greatest is a construct. Malcolm X is the greatest American film of all time. I would actually argue they're essentially the same movie, which is kind of terrible. Malcolm X is a Hollywood-produced biopic detailing the life of the great African-American revolutionary, Malcolm X. Would you believe they were going to make a white guy direct it? When Spike was eventually hired to direct, he clashed with Warner Bros. Primarily over the budget and runtime, eventually having to use money out of his own pocket and borrow from others. The studio even shut the whole project down at one point. He had to wrestle with them, but eventually it got made. A sweeping epic about the life and work of Malcolm X, the great black radical, using the money and language of the evil white people he was against. I never give up an opportunity to complain about the Hollywood biopic of Bob Marley that got released last year, only partially because it was boring and mid and forgettable and nothing happened. But the bigger thing that actually upsets me is that I don't think Bob himself would want it to exist. His whole work, his whole philosophy was about a collective struggle, collective strength. People, no I. It's I and I. The film makes Bob Marley into this sort of heroic figure but gives us almost no context as to what the society he was living in was actually like, what made his work influential in the first place. I loved Oppenheimer, but it's also a bit evil, because it centers the life and perspective of this one guy, even though the impact and pain of what he did was felt by so many. Yet that was also kind of the point. It's a great film. It's one of the great American films, I think. Not made by an American though. Not even starring an American. But the language itself is distinctly American. Malcolm X is a superhero movie. Malcolm X is a tragedy. Malcolm X is not about racism. It's not about white supremacy. It's not about capitalism. It's about Malcolm X. Those things are in and surrounding the film, but Citizen Kane is about Charles Foster Kane. Malcolm X is about Malcolm X. An imagined version of Malcolm X painted by Spike Lee, delivered by Denzel Washington, and distributed through Warner Bros. It's very American.
Charles Foster Kane, in every essence of his social beliefs, is, in fact, nothing more or less than a communist.
He is today what he has always been, and always will be, a fascist.
And still another opinion.
I was studying Persepolis for a class. I bought and read the graphic novels for the first time last year, having watched the film before and rewatched it for this class, but my relationship with it has become more complicated. It's written, illustrated, and in the film's case, co-directed by an Iranian woman about her Iranian experience growing up during the time of the Islamic Revolution, but it was distributed and produced in France, where she's been living and working for decades now. She self-exiled from Iran, and both the film and books are banned from Iran because the content is very critical of Iran, or at least its government. It's also very critical about Europe, but it is, of course, mainly centered in Iran. When I rewatched it for the class, the question came to me: is Persepolis French or Iranian? People more recently have been getting critical of Persepolis, especially because of the issue of the veil. Marjane Satrapi, the creator, clearly doesn't care much for the veil, and in the story it is largely portrayed as oppressive. For most of my time reading this, I always just saw it as feminist. But from a Western standpoint, we are always being fed images of those mysterious, oppressive regimes, quote-unquote regimes. Recent geopolitical happenings have made me start to think about that a bit. Words like regime, and the people who like saying those words. How is it that I and most people on this side of the world have been groomed to view countries like Iran? But this was made by an Iranian woman who's giving this very three-dimensional, nuanced look at her life and her complicated relationship with her heritage. Something I relate to myself. But it is being delivered through this Western channel in French, translated into all these other languages. When you watch the film, everyone speaks French, except for other European characters. You never hear the Iranian language at all. It stylistically uses the aesthetics of Iranian art, but also flows in a very Western style. As the character, the person is by her own admission very westernized. Yet she will always call Iran her home, and never quite feels at place in Europe either. Is this a work of subversive Iranian rebellion? Or very clever Western Islamophobic propaganda? Can there be a true American cinema when all the techniques are borrowed from others? All the DNA you see in Griffith was lifted from other techniques around the world, but delivered through this powerful system. In one sense, the only true American cinema is that made by the Native Americans, but that's not what we think about when we hear that expression. What about South and Central America? The face of American cinema owes its image to all the cinema around the world. Not every American filmmaker is even American. Bong Joon-ho made history with the first non-US, non-English language film to win Best Picture at the Oscars, an American competition, but he's worked in America, on American films, with American actors, both before that and since. Hell, half of the big American actors we recognize who star in Hollywood films nowadays are from the UK. The big narrative through line I see when I look at American cinema and American filmmakers is that they're all questioning what America even is and ought to be. The trouble is that the question itself is complicated. I started considering all of this because on damn Letterboxd, there came a point when I started labeling what countries the films I watch come from precisely because I want to watch more films from movements and cultures that don't have this disproportionate amount of power. So every time I log an American film, I know I low-key could be watching something else. But then I'd feel bad when I watch an African American film and be thinking, but this is a whole other lineage though. I watch an Oscar Michaud film and I'm like, this is one of the overlooked canons in the mainstream. Yet, even African American films fit into the ecosystem of American films in their lack of mainstream dominance. They share the DNA, undoubtedly, but respond to certain things in a completely different way. Malcolm X low-key feels like it could have been directed by a white guy, and fits into the ecosystem of commodified black art I spoke about in my last video that about 4 people and their cats watched, yet it is unmistakably a Spike Lee joint. It feels like a film that responds to a lineage, though knows it's being used to hurt it. It's great and a little evil. It's very American.
We can do anything vile and anything great, and all the generalizations are true and all of them are boring.